Popular Government. Sir Henry Sumner Maine. 1885. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Essay 3. The Age of Progress. There is no doubt that some of the most inventive, most polite, and best instructed portions of the human race are at present going through a stage of thought which, if it stood by itself, would suggest that there is nothing of which human nature is so tolerant, or so deeply enamored, as the transformation of laws and institutions. A series of political and social changes, which a century ago no man would have thought capable of being effected save by the sharp convulsion of revolution, is now contemplated by the bulk of many civilized communities as sure to be carried out, a certain number of persons regarding the prospect with exuberant hope, a somewhat larger number with equanimity, many more with indifference or resignation. At the end of the last century, a revolution in France shook the whole civilized world, and the consequence of the terrible events and bitter disappointments which it brought with it was to arrest all improvement in Great Britain for 30 years, merely because it was innovation. But in 1830 a second explosion occurred in France, followed by the reconstruction of the British electorate in 1832, and with the British Reformed Parliament began that period of continuous legislation through which, not this country alone, but all Western Europe appears to be passing. It is not often recognized how excessively rare in the world was sustained legislative activity till rather more than 50 years ago, and thus sufficient attention has not been given to some characteristics of this particular mode of exercising sovereign power, which we call legislation. It has obviously many advantages over revolution as an instrument of change. While it has quite as trenchant an edge, it is milder, juster, more equable, and sometimes better considered. But in one respect, as at present understood, it may prove to be more dangerous than revolution. Political insanity takes strange forms, and there may be some persons in some countries who look forward to the revolution as implying a series of revolutions. But, on the whole, a revolution is regarded as doing all its work at once. Legislation, however, is contemplated as never-ending. One stage of it is doubtless more or less distinctly conceived. It will not be arrested till the legislative power itself, and all kinds of authority at any time exercised by states, have been vested in the people, the many, the great majority of the human beings making up each community. The prospect beyond that is dim, and perhaps will prove to be as fertile in disappointment as is always the morrow of a revolution. But doubtless the popular expectation is that, after the establishment of a democracy, there will be as much reforming legislation as ever. This zeal for political movement, gradually identifying itself with a taste for democracy, has not as yet fully had its way in all the societies of Western Europe. But it has greatly affected the institutions of some of them. Even when it is checked or arrested, it is shared by considerable minorities of their population, and when, as in Russia, these minorities are very small, the excessive concentration of the passion for change has a manifest tendency to make it dangerously explosive. The analogies to this state of feeling in the past must be sought rather in the history of religion than in the history of politics. There is some resemblance between the period of political reform in the 19th century and the period of religious reformation in the 16th. Now, as then, the multitude of followers must be distinguished from the smaller group of leaders. Now, as then, there are a certain number of zealots who desire that truth shall prevail. Some of them conceive the movement which they stimulate as an escape from what is distinctly bad, others as an advance from what is barely tolerable to what is greatly better, and a few as an ascent to an ideal state, sometimes conceived by them as a state of nature, and sometimes as a condition of millennial blessedness. But, behind these, now as then, there is a crowd which has imbibed a delight in change for its own sake, who would reform the suffrage, or the House of Lords, or the land laws, or the union with Ireland, in precisely the same spirit in which the mob behind the reformers of religion broke the nose of a saint in stone, or made a bonfire of copes and surplices, or shouted for the government of the church by presbyteries. The passion for religious reform is, however, far more intelligible than the passion for political change, as we now see it in operation. In an intensely believing society, the obligation to think aright was enforced by tremendous penalties, and the sense of this obligation was the propelling force of the Reformation, as at an earlier date it had been the propelling force of the rise and spread of Christianity. But what propelling force is there behind the present political movement, of such inherent energy that it not only animates the minority, who undoubtedly believe in their theories of democracy, or reform, or regeneration, but even makes itself felt by the multitude which reasons blindly or does not reason at all? If you have wrong ideas about justification, you shall perish everlastingly, is a very intelligible proposition, but it is not exactly a proposition of the same order as that into which most English democratic philosophy translates itself. If you vote straight with the blues, your great-grandchild will be on a level with the average citizen of the United States. The truth seems to be, that a great number of persons are satisfied to think that democracy is inevitable and the democratic movement irresistible, which means that the phenomenon exists, that they see no way of arresting it, and that they feel no inclination to throw themselves in its way. There are others who appear to think that when a man submits to the inevitable it is greatly to his credit, as it was to Mr. Gilbert's nautical hero to remain an Englishman because he was born an Englishman. So they baptize the movement with various complimentary names, of which the commonest is progress, a word of which I have never seen any definition, and which seems to have all sorts of meanings, many of them extraordinary, for some politicians in our day appear to employ it for mere aimless movement, while others actually use it for movement backwards, towards a state of primitive nature. It is an inquiry of considerable interest, whether the passion for change which has possession of a certain number of persons in this age, and the acquiescence in it which characterizes a much larger number, are due to any exceptional causes affecting the sphere of politics, or whether they are universal and permanent phenomena of human nature. There are some striking facts which appear to point to the first conclusion as the more correct. The most remarkable is the relatively small portion of the human race which will so much as tolerate a proposal or attempt to change its usages, laws, and institutions. Vast populations, some of them with a civilization considerable but peculiar, detest that which in the language of the West would be called reform. The entire Mohammedan world detests it. The multitudes of colored men who swarm in the great continent of Africa detest it, and it is detested by that large part of mankind which we are accustomed to leave on one side as barbarous or savage. The millions upon millions of men who fill the Chinese empire loathe it and, what is more, despise it. There are few things more remarkable and, in their way, more instructive, than the stubborn incredulity and disdain which a man belonging to the cultivated part of Chinese society opposes to the vaunts of Western civilization which he frequently hears, and his confidence in his own ideas is alike proof against his experience of Western military superiority and against that spectacle of the scientific inventions and discoveries of the West which overcame the exclusiveness of the undoubtedly feebler Japanese. There is in India a minority, educated at the feet of English politicians and in books saturated with English political ideas, which has learned to repeat their language, but it is doubtful whether even these, if they had a voice in the matter, would allow a finger to be laid on the very subjects with which European legislation is beginning to concern itself, social and religious usage. There is not, however, the shadow of a doubt that the enormous mass of the Indian population hates and dreads change, as is natural in the parts of a body social solidified by caste. The chief difficulty of Indian government is even less the difficulty of reconciling this strong and abiding sentiment with the fainter feeling of the anglicized minority, than the practical impossibility of getting it understood by the English people. It is quite evident that the greatest fact in Anglo-Indian history, the mutiny of the mercenary sepoy army, is as much a mystery to the average man of the West as are certain colors to the colorblind, and even historians are compelled to supply wholly or partially fictitious explanations of the events of 1857 to a public which cannot be brought to believe that a vast popular uprising was produced by a prejudice about a greased cartridge. The intense conservatism of much the largest part of mankind is, however, attested by quite as much evidence as is the pride of certain nations in railways, electric telegraphs, or democratic governments. In spite of overwhelming evidence, I wrote in 1861, it is most difficult for a citizen of Western Europe to bring thoroughly home to himself the truth that the civilization which surrounds him is a rare exception in the history of the world. The tone of thought common among us, all our hopes, fears, and speculations, would be materially affected, if we had vividly before us the relation of the progressive races to the totality of human life. It is indisputable that much the greatest part of mankind has never shown a particle of desire that its civil institutions should be improved, since the moment when external completeness was first given to them by their embodiment in some permanent record. One set of usages has occasionally been violently overthrown and superseded by another. Here and there a primitive code, pretending to a supernatural origin, has been greatly extended and distorted into the most surprising forms, but, except in a small section of the world, there has been nothing like the gradual amelioration of a legal system. There has been material civilization, but instead of the civilization expanding the law has limited the civilization. To the fact that the enthusiasm for change is comparatively rare must be added the fact that it is extremely modern. It is known but to a small part of mankind, and to that part but for a short period during a history of incalculable length. It is not older than the free employment of legislation by popular governments. There are few historical errors more serious than the assumption that popular governments have always been legislating governments. Some of them, no doubt, legislated on a scale which would now be considered extremely moderate, but, on the whole, their vigor has shown itself in struggles to restore or maintain some ancient constitution, sometimes lying far back in a partly real and partly imaginary past, sometimes referred to a wholly unhistorical state of nature, sometimes associated with the great name of an original legislator. We, Englishmen, have had for several centuries a government in which there was a strong popular element, and for 2 centuries we have had a nearly unqualified popular government. Yet what our forefathers contended for was not a typical constitution in the future, but a typical constitution in the past. Our periods of what would now be called legislative reforming activity have been connected with moments, not of violent political but of violent religious emotion, with the outbreak of feeling at the Reformation, with the dominion of Cromwell and the Independents, the true precursors of the modern irreconcilables, and with the revival of dread and dislike of the Roman Catholic Church during the reign of James II. During the period at which English popular government was attracting to itself the admiration of the educated classes throughout the civilized world, the Parliament of our Hanoverian kings was busy with controlling executive action, with the discussion of foreign policy, with vehement debates on foreign wars, but it hardly legislated at all. The truth is that the enthusiasm for legislative change took its rise, not in a popularly governed but in an autocratically governed country, not in England but in France. The English political institutions, so envied and panegyrized on the continent, could not be copied without sweeping legislative innovations, but the grounds and principles on which these innovations were demanded were, as we shall see, wholly unlike anything known to any class of English politicians. Nevertheless, in their final effects, these French ideas have deeply leavened English political thought, mixing with another stream of opinion which is of recent but still of English origin. An absolute intolerance even of that description of change which in modern language we call political thus characterizes much the largest part of the human race, and has characterized the whole of it during the largest part of its history. Are there then any reasons for thinking that the love for change which in our day is commonly supposed to be overpowering, and the capacity for it which is vulgarly assumed to be infinite, are, after all, limited to a very narrow sphere of human action, that which we call politics, and perhaps not even to the whole of this sphere? Let us look at those parts of human nature which have no points of contact with politics, because the authority of the sovereign state is not brought to bear upon them at all, or at most remotely and indirectly. Let us attend for a moment to human habits, those modes of conduct and behavior which we follow either quite unconsciously or with no better reason to assign for them than that we have always followed them. Do we readily change our habits? Man is a creature of habit, says an adage which doubtless sums up a vast experience. It is true that the tenacity with which men adhere to habit is not precisely the same in all parts of the globe. It is strictest in the East. It is relaxed in the West, and of all races the English and their descendants, the Americans, are least reluctant to submit to a considerable change of habit for what seems to them an adequate end. Yet the exception is one of the sort which proves the rule. The Englishman, who transports himself to Australia or to India, surrounds himself, under the greatest difficulties, with as close an imitation of English life as he can contrive, and submits all the while to a distasteful exile in the hope of some day returning to the life which he lived in his youth or childhood, though under somewhat more favorable conditions. The truth is that men do alter their habits, but within narrow limits, and almost always with more or less of reluctance and pain. And it is fortunate for them that they are so constituted, for most of their habits have been learned by the race to which they belong through long experience, and probably after much suffering. A man cannot safely eat or drink, or go downstairs, or cross a street, unless he be guided and protected by habits which are the long result of time. One set in particular of these habits, and perhaps the most surprising, that which enables us to deal safely with the destructive element of fire, was probably not acquired by mankind without infinite pain and injury. And all this, for all we know, may be true of the public usages which men follow in common with their fellows. Let us turn from habits to manners, that is, to those customs of behavior which we not only practice ourselves, but expect other men to follow. Do these suggest that men are naturally tolerant of departure from a usage or an accustomed line of conduct? Rarely as the subject is examined, it is a very curious one. What is the exact source of the revulsion of feeling which is indubitably caused by a solecism in manners or speech, and of the harshness of the judgment passed on it? Why should the unusual employment of a fork or a finger glass, or the mispronunciation of a vowel or an aspirate, have the effect of instantly quenching an appreciable amount of human sympathy? Some things about the sentiment are certain. It is not modern, but very ancient, and probably as old as human nature. The incalculably ancient distinctions between one race and another, between Greek and barbarian, with all the mutual detestation they carried with them, appear to have been founded originally on nothing more than dislike of differences in speech. Again, the sentiment is not confined to the idle and possibly superfine regions of society. It goes down to the humblest social spheres, where, though the code of manners is different, it is even more rigidly enforced. Whatever else these facts may suggest, they assuredly do not suggest the changeableness of human nature. There are, however, other facts, even more remarkable and instructive, which point to the same conclusion. One half of the human race at this moment and in our part of the world, the majority of it have hitherto been kept aloof from politics, nor, till quite recently, was there any evidence that any portion of this body of human beings cared more to embark in politics than to engage in war. There is therefore in all human societies a great and influential class, everywhere possessed of intellectual power, and here of intellectual cultivation, which is essentially non-political. Are, then, women characterized by a passion for change? Surely there is no fact witnessed to by a greater amount of experience than that, in all communities, they are the strictest conservators of usage and the sternest censors of departure from accepted rules of morals, manners, and fashions. Souvent femme varie, says indeed the French song attributed to Francis I, but subtler observers of female nature than a French king of extraordinary dissoluteness have come to a very different conclusion. 3 and, even in the relations of the sexes, have gone near to claiming constancy as a special and distinctive female virtue. This seems to have been an article of faith with Thackeray and Trollope, but the art which Thackeray and Trollope followed is itself furnishing striking illustrations of the conservatism of women. During the last 15 years, it has fallen very largely into their hands. What, then, is the view of life and society which is taken on the whole by this literature of fiction, produced in enormous and ever-growing abundance, and read by multitudes? I may at least say that, if no other part of the writings of this generation survived, the very last impression which this branch of literature would produce would be that we had lived in an age of feverish progress. For in the world of novels, it is the ancient and time-hallowed that seems, as a rule, to call forth admiration or enthusiasm. The conventional distinctions of society have a much higher importance given to them than belongs to them in real life. Wealth is on the whole regarded as ridiculous, unless associated with birth, and zeal for reform is in much danger of being identified with injustice, absurdity, or crime. These books, ever more written by women, and read by increasing multitudes of women, leave no doubt as to the fundamental character of female taste and opinion. It must be admitted, on the other hand, that one special set of customs, which we know collectively as fashion, have been left to the peculiar guardianship of women, and there is no doubt a common impression that fashion is always changing. But is it true that fashions vary very widely and very rapidly? Doubtless they do change. In some of the great cities of Europe something like real genius is called into activity, and countless experiments are tried, in order that something may be devised which is new, and yet shall not shock the strong attachment to the old. Much of this ingenuity fails, some part of it sometimes succeeds, yet the change is very seldom great, and it is just as often a reversion to the old as an adoption of something new. We speak, I said in a former work, of the caprices of fashion, yet, on examining them historically, we find them extraordinarily limited, so much so that we are sometimes tempted to regard fashion as passing through cycles of form ever repeating themselves. The eccentricities of female dress mentioned in the Old Testament may still be recognized. The Greek lady represented by the so-called Tanagra figures is surprisingly like a lady of our time, and, on looking through a volume of medieval costumes, we see portions of dress which, slightly disguised, have been over and over again revived by the dressmaking inventiveness of Paris. Here, again, we may observe that it is extremely fortunate for a large part of the human race that female fashions do not alter extensively and rapidly. For sudden and frequent changes in them, changes which would more or less affect half of mankind in the wealthiest regions of the world, would entail industrial revolutions of the most formidable kind. One may ask oneself what is the most terrible calamity which can be conceived as befalling great populations. The answer might perhaps be a sanguinary war, a desolating famine, a deadly epidemic disease. Yet none of these disasters would cause as much and as prolonged human suffering as a revolution in fashion under which women should dress, as men practically do, in one material of one color. There are many flourishing and opulent cities in Europe and America which would be condemned by it to bankruptcy or starvation, and it would be worse than a famine or a pestilence in China, India, and Japan. This view of the very slight changeableness of human nature when left to itself, is much strengthened by the recent inquiries which have extended the history of the human race in new directions. The investigations inconveniently called prehistoric are really aimed at enlarging the domain of history, by collecting materials for it beyond the point at which it began to be embodied in writing. They proceed by the examination of the modes of life and social usages of men in a savage, barbarous, or semi-civilized condition, and they start from the assumption that the civilized races were once in that state, or in some such state. Unquestionably, these studies are not in a wholly satisfactory stage. As often happens where the laborers are comparatively few and the evidence as yet scanty, they abound in rash conclusions and peremptory assertions. But they have undoubtedly increased our knowledge of social states which are no longer ours, and of civilizations which are unlike ours. And on the whole, they suggest that the differences which, after ages of change, separate the civilized man from the savage or barbarian, are not so great as the vulgar opinion would have them. Man has changed much in Western Europe, but it is singular how much of the savage there still is in him, independently of the identity of the physical constitution which has always belonged to him. There are a number of occupations which civilized men follow with the utmost eagerness, and a number of tastes in which they indulge with the keenest pleasure, without being able to account for them intellectually, or to reconcile them with accepted morality. These pursuits and tastes are, as a rule, common to the civilized man and the savage. Like the savage, the Englishman, Frenchman, or American makes war. Like the savage, he hunts. Like the savage, he dances. Like the savage, he indulges in endless deliberation. Like the savage, he sets an extravagant value on rhetoric. Like the savage, he is a man of party, with a newspaper for a totem, instead of a mark on his forehead or arm. And, like a savage, he is apt to make of his totem his god. He submits to naming these tastes and pursuits denounced in books, speeches, or sermons, but he probably derives acuter pleasure from them than from anything else he does. If, then, there is any reason for supposing that human nature, taken as a whole, is not wedded to change, and that, in most of its parts, it changes only by slow steps, or within narrow limits if the maxim of Seneca be true of it, non git statum ex diverso in diversum transistus, it is worth our while to investigate the probable causes of the exceptional enthusiasm for change in politics which seems to grow up from time to time, giving to many minds the sense of having in their presence an inflexible, inexorable, predetermined process. I may first observe that, in the popular mind, there is a manifest association of political innovation with scientific advance. It is not uncommon to hear a politician supporting an argument for a radical reform by asserting that this is an age of progress, and appealing for proof of the assertion to the railway, the gigantic steamship, the electric light, or the electric telegraph. Now it is quite true that, if progress be understood with its only intelligible meaning, that is, as the continued production of new ideas, scientific invention and scientific discovery are the great and perennial sources of these ideas. Every fresh conquest of nature by man, giving him the command of her forces, and every new and successful interpretation of her secrets, generates a number of new ideas, which finally displace the old ones, and occupy their room. But, in the Western world, the mere formation of new ideas does not often or necessarily create a taste for innovating legislation. In the East, no doubt, it is otherwise. Where a community associates the bulk of its social usages with a religious sanction, and again associates its religion with an old and false interpretation of nature, the most elementary knowledge of geography or physics may overthrow a mass of fixed ideas concerning the constitution of society. An Indian youth learns that Abraham is semi-divine, and that it is a deadly sin to taste the flesh of a cow, but he also learns that Ceylon, which is close to India, is an island peopled with demons, and the easy exposure of such delusions may change his entire view of human life, and indeed is the probable explanation of the great gulf which in India divides the educated class from the uneducated. A similar revolution of ideas is very rare in the West, and indeed experience shows that innovating legislation is connected not so much with science as with the scientific air which certain subjects, not capable of exact scientific treatment, from time to time assume. To this class of subjects belonged Bentham's scheme of law reform, and, above all, political economy as treated by Ricardo. Both have been extremely fertile sources of legislation during the last 50 years. But both have now fallen almost entirely out of fashion, and their present disfavor may serve as a warning against too hastily assuming that the existing friendly alliance between advanced politicians and advancing science will always continue. When invention has been successfully applied to the arts of life, the disturbance of habits and displacement of industries, which the application occasions, has always been at first profoundly unpopular. Men have submitted to street lighting and railway traveling, which they once clamored against, but Englishmen never submitted to the poor law, the first great effort of economical legislation, and it has got to be seen whether they will submit to free trade. The prejudices of the multitude against scientific inventions are dismissed by the historian with a sarcasm, but, when the multitude is all-powerful, this prejudice may afford material for history. The principal cause of an apparent enthusiasm for innovating legislation is not as often assigned as it should be. Legislation is one of the activities of popular government, and the keenest interest in these activities is felt by all the popularly governed communities. It is one great advantage of popular government over government of the older type, that it is so intensely interesting. For 20 years, we had close to our shores a striking example of this point of inferiority in absolute monarchies during the continuance of the Second Bonapartist Empire in France. It never overcame the disadvantage it suffered through the dullness of its home politics. The scandal, the personalities, the gossip, and the trifling which occupied its newspapers proved no substitute for the political discussions which had filled them while the Republic and the constitutional monarchy lasted. The men who ruled it were acutely conscious of the danger involved in this decline of excitement and amusement suitable to cultivated and masculine minds, and their efforts to meet it led directly to their overthrow, by tempting them to provide the French public with distractions of a higher order, through adventurous diplomacy and war. There are, again, good observers who trace the political insecurity of Russia, the aggressiveness of her government abroad, and the wild attempts on it at home, to the general dullness of Russian life during peace. Englishmen would find it almost impossible to conceive what would compensate them for the withdrawal of the enthralling drama which is enacted before them every morning and evening. A ceaseless flow of public discussion, a throng of public events, a crowd of public men, make up the spectacle. Nevertheless, in our country at all events, overindulgence in what has no doubt become a passion with elevated minds is growing to be dangerous. For the plot of the performance which attracts such multitudes turns, nowadays, almost always on the fortunes of some legislative measure. The English Parliament, as has been said, legislated very little until 50 years since, when it fell under the influence of Bentham and his disciples. Ever since the first Reform Act, however, the volume of legislation has been increasing, and this has been very much owing to the unlooked-for operation of a venerable constitutional form, the royal speech at the commencement of each session. Once it was the king who spoke, now it is the cabinet as the organ of the party who supports it, and it is rapidly becoming the practice for parties to outbid one another in the length of the tale of legislation to which they pledge themselves in successive royal speeches. There is undoubted danger in looking upon politics as a deeply interesting game, a never-ending cricket match between blue and yellow. The practice is yet more dangerous when the ever-accumulating stakes are legislative measures upon which the whole future of this country is risked, and the danger is peculiarly great under a constitutional system which does not provide for measures reforming the Constitution any different or more solemn procedure than that which is followed in ordinary legislation. Neither experience nor probability affords any ground for thinking that there may be an infinity of legislative innovation, at once safe and beneficent. On the contrary, it would be a safer conjecture that the possibilities of reform are strictly limited. The possibilities of heat, it is said, reach 2000 degrees of the centigrade thermometer, the possibilities of cold extend to about 300 degrees below its zero, but all organic life in the world is only possible through the accident that temperature in it ranges between a maximum of 120 degrees and a minimum of a few degrees below zero of the centigrade. For all we know, a similarly narrow limitation may hold of legislative changes in the structure of human society. We can no more argue that, because some past reforms have succeeded, all reforms will succeed, then we can argue that, because the human body can bear a certain amount of heat, it can bear an indefinite amount. There are, however, many accidents of their history, and particularly of their recent history, which blind Englishmen to the necessity of caution while they indulge in the pastime of politics, particularly when the two sides into which they divide themselves compete in legislative innovation. We are singularly little sensible, as a nation, of the extraordinary good luck which has befallen us since the beginning of the century. Foreign observers, until perhaps the other day, were always dwelling on it, but Englishmen, as a rule, do not notice it, or, it may be, secretly believe that they deserve it. The fact is that, since the century began, we have been victorious and prosperous beyond all example. We have never lost a battle in Europe or a square mile of territory, we have never taken a ruinous step in foreign politics, we have never made an irreparable mistake in legislation. If we compare our history with recent French history, there is nothing in it like the disaster at Sedan or the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, nothing like the gratuitous quarrel with Germany about the vacant crown of Spain, nothing like the awe of May 1850, which, by altering the suffrage, gave the great enemy of the Republic the opportunity for which he had been waiting. Yet, if we multiply occasions for such calamities, it is possible and even probable that they will occur, and it is useless to deny that, with the craving for political excitement which is growing on us every day, the chances of a great false step are growing also. I do not think it likely to be denied, that the activity of popular government is more and more tending to exhibit itself in legislation, or that the materials for legislation are being constantly supplied in ever-increasing abundance through the competition of parties, or, lastly, that the keen interest which the community takes in looking on, as a body of spectators, at the various activities of popular government, is the chief reason of the general impression that ours is an age of progress, to be indefinitely continued. There are, however, other causes of this impression or belief, which are much less obvious and much less easily demonstrated to the ordinary English politician. At the head of them, are a group of words, phrases, maxims, and general propositions, which have their root in political theories, not indeed far removed from us by distance of time, but as much forgotten by the mass of mankind as if they had belonged to the remotest antiquity. How is one to convince the advanced English politician who announces with an air of pride that he is radical, and indeed a radical and something more, that he is calling himself by a name which he would never have had the courage to adopt, so deep was its disrepute, if Jeremy Bentham had not given it respectability by associating it with a particular theory of legislation and politics. How is one to persuade him, when he speaks of the sovereign people, that he employs a combination of words which would never have occurred to his mind if in 1762 a French philosopher had not written a speculative essay on the origin of society, the formation of states, and the nature of government? Neither of these theories, the theory of Rousseau which starts from the assumed natural rights of man, or the theory of Bentham which is based on the hypothetical greatest happiness principle, is nowadays explicitly held by many people. The natural rights of man have indeed made their appearance in recent political discourse, producing much the same effect as if a professed lecturer on astronomy were to declare his belief in the Ptolemaic spheres and to call upon his audience to admire their music. But, of the two theories mentioned above, that of Rousseau which recognizes these rights is much the most thoroughly forgotten. For the attempt to apply it led to terrible calamities, while the theory of Bentham has at present led to nothing worse than a certain amount of disappointment. How is it then that these wholly or partially exploded speculations still exercise a most real and practical influence on political thought? The fact is that political theories are endowed with the faculty possessed by the hero of the border ballad. When their legs are smitten off, they fight upon their stumps. They produce a host of words, and of ideas associated with those words, which remain active and combatant after the parent speculation is mutilated or dead. Their posthumous influence often extends a good way beyond the domain of politics. It does not seem to me a fantastic assertion that the ideas of one of the great novelists of the last generation may be traced to Bentham, and those of another to Rousseau. Dickens, who spent his early manhood among the politicians of 1832 trained in Bentham's school, hardly ever wrote a novel without attacking an abuse. The procedure of the Court of Chancery and of the ecclesiastical courts, the delays of the public offices, the costliness of divorce, the state of the dwellings of the poor, and the condition of the cheap schools in the north of England, furnished him with what he seemed to consider, in all sincerity, the true moral of a series of fictions. The opinions of Thackeray have a strong resemblance to those to which Rousseau gave popularity. It is a very just remark of Mill, that the attraction which nature and the state of nature had for Rousseau may be partly accounted for as a reaction against the excessive admiration of civilization and progress which took possession of educated men during the earlier part of the 18th century. Theoretically, at any rate, Thackeray hated the artificialities of civilization, and it must be owned that some of his favorite personages have about them something of Rousseau's natural man as he would have shown himself if he had mixed in real life something, that is, of the violent blackguard. The influence which the political theory originating in France and the political theory originating in England still exercise over politics seems to me as certain as anything in the history of thought can be. It is necessary to examine these theories, because there is no other way of showing the true value of the instruments, the derivative words and derivative ideas, through which they act. I will take first the famous constitutional theory of Rousseau, which, long unfamiliar or discredited in this country, is the fountain of many notions which have suddenly become popular and powerful among us. There is much difficulty in the attempt to place it in a clear light, for reasons well known to all who have given attention to the philosophy of the remarkable man who produced it. This philosophy is the most striking example extant of a confusion which may be detected in all corners of non-scientific modern thought, the confusion between what is and what ought to be, between what did as a fact occur and what under certain conditions would have occurred. The contrat social, which sets forth the political theory on which I am engaged, appears at first sight to give an historical account of the emergence of mankind from a state of nature. But whether it is meant that mankind did emerge in this way, whether the writer believes that only a happily circumstanced part of the human race had this experience, or whether he thinks that nature, a beneficent legislatress, intended all men to have it, but that her objects were defeated, it is quite impossible to say with any confidence. The language of Rousseau sometimes suggests that he meant his picture of early social transformations to be regarded as imaginary, but nevertheless the account given of them is so precise, detailed, and logically built up, that it is quite inconceivable its author should not have intended it to express realities. This celebrated theory is briefly as follows. Rousseau, who in his earlier writings had strongly insisted on the disadvantages which man had sustained through the loss of his natural rights, begins the contrat social with the position that man was originally in the state of nature. So long as he remained in it, he was before all things free. But, in course of time, a point is reached at which the obstacles to his continuance in the natural condition become insuperable. Mankind then enter into the social compact under which the state, society, or community is formed. Their consent to make this compact must be unanimous, but the effect of its completion is the absolute alienation or surrender, by every individual human being, of his person and all his rights to the aggregate community. The community then becomes the sovereign, the true and original sovereign people, and it is an autocratic sovereign. It ought to maintain liberty and equality among its subjects, but only because the subjection of one individual to another is a loss of force to the state, and because there cannot be liberty without equality. The collective despot cannot divide, or alienate, or delegate his power. The government is his servant, and is merely the organ of correspondence between the sovereign and the people. No representation of the people is allowed. Rousseau abhorred the representative system, but periodical assemblies of the entire community are to be held, and two questions are to be submitted to them: whether it is the pleasure of the sovereign to maintain the present form of government, and whether the sovereign pleases to leave the administration of its affairs to the persons who now conduct it. The autocracy of the aggregate community and the indivisibility, perpetuity, and incommunicable character of its power, are insisted upon in every part of the contrat social and in every form of words. As is almost always the case with sweeping theories, portions of Rousseau's ideas may be discovered in the speculations of older writers. A part may be found, a century earlier, in the writings of Hobbes, another part in those of the nearly contemporary school of French economists. But the theory, as he put it together, owes to him its extraordinary influence, and it is the undoubted parent of a host of phrases and associated notions which, after having long had currency in France and on the continent, are beginning to have serious effect in this country, as the democratic element in its constitution increases. From this origin sprang the people, with a capital P, the sovereign people, the people the sole source of all legitimate power. From this came the subordination of governments, not merely to electorates but to a vaguely defined multitude outside them, or to the still vaguer mastership of floating opinion. Hence began the limitation of legitimacy in governments to governments which approximate to democracy. A vastly more formidable conception bequeathed to us by Rousseau is that of the omnipotent democratic state rooted in natural right, the state which has at its absolute disposal everything which individual men value, their property, their persons, and their independence, the state which is bound to respect neither precedent nor prescription, the state which may make laws for its subjects ordaining what they shall drink or eat, and in what way they shall spend their earnings, the state which can confiscate all the land of the community, and which, if the effect on human motives is what it may be expected to be, may force us to labor on it when the older incentives to toil have disappeared. Nevertheless, this political speculation, of which the remote and indirect consequences press us on all sides, is of all speculations the most baseless. The natural condition from which it starts is a simple figment of the imagination. So far as any research into the nature of primitive human society has any bearing on so mere a dream, all inquiry has dissipated it. The process by which Rousseau supposes communities of men to have been formed, or by which at all events he wishes us to assume that they were formed, is again a chimera. No general assertion as to the way in which human societies grew up is safe, but perhaps the safest of all is that none of them were formed in the way imagined by Rousseau. The true relation of some parts of the theory to fact is very instructive. Some particles of Rousseau's thought may be discovered in the mental atmosphere of his time. Natural law and natural rights are phrases properly belonging to a theory not of politics, but of jurisprudence, which, originating with the Roman jurisconsults, had a great attraction for the lawyers of France. The despotic sovereign of the contrat social, the all-powerful community, is an inverted copy of the King of France invested with an authority claimed for him by his courtiers and by the more courtly of his lawyers, but denied to him by all the highest minds in the country, and specially by the great luminaries of the French parliaments. The omnipotent democracy is the king proprietor, the lord of all men's fortunes and persons, but it is the French king turned upside down. The mass of natural rights absorbed by the sovereign community through the social compact is, again, nothing more than the old divine right of kings in a new dress. As for Rousseau's dislike of representative systems and his requirement that the entire community should meet periodically to exercise its sovereignty, his language in the contrat social suggests that he was led to these opinions by the example of the ancient tribal democracies. But at a later date he declared that he had the Constitution of Geneva before his mind, and he cannot but have known that the exact method of government which he proposed still lived in the oldest cantons of Switzerland. This denial to the collective community of all power of acting in its sovereign capacity through representatives is so formidable, as apparently to forbid any practical application of Rousseau's theory. Rousseau, indeed, expressly says that his principles apply to small communities only, hinting at the same time that they may be adapted to states having a large territory by a system of confederation, and in this hint we may suspect that we have the germ of the opinion, which has become an article of faith in modern continental radicalism, that freedom is best secured by breaking up great commonwealths into small self-governing communes. But the time was not ripe for such a doctrine at the end of the last century, and real vitality was for the first time given to the speculation of Rousseau by that pamphlet of Sieyes, Qu'est-ce que le tiers état? Which did so much to determine the early stages of the French Revolution. As even the famous first page of this pamphlet is often misquoted, what follows it is not perhaps always carefully read, and it may have escaped notice that much of it simply reproduces the theory of Rousseau. But then Sieyès reproduces this theory with a difference. The most important claim which he advanced, and which he succeeded in making good, was that the three orders should sit together and form a national assembly. The argument by which he reaches this conclusion is substantially that of the contrat social. With Sieyès, as with Rousseau, man begins in the natural condition, he enters society by a social compact, and by virtue of this compact an all-powerful community is formed. But then Sieyès had not the objection of Rousseau to representation, which indeed was one of his favorite subjects of speculation during life. He allows the community to make a large preliminary delegation of its powers by representation. Thus is formed the class of representative bodies to which the future National Assembly of France was to belong. Sieyès calls them extraordinary, and describes them as exercising their will like men in a state of nature, as standing in place of the nation, as incapable of being tied down to any particular decision or line of legislation. Ordinary representative bodies are, on the other hand, legislatures deriving their powers from a constitution which the extraordinary assembly has formed and strictly confined to the exercise of these powers. The extraordinary assembly is thus the sovereign community of Rousseau, the ordinary assembly is his government. To the first class belong those despotic bodies which, under the name of National Assembly or Convention, have 4 times governed France, never successfully and sometimes disastrously. To the second belong the legislative assemblies and chambers of deputies so often overthrown by revolution. The other theory, from which a number of political phrases and political ideas now circulating among us have descended, is of English origin, and had Jeremy Bentham for its author. Its contribution to this currency is at this moment smaller than that which may be traced to a French source in the Contrat Social, but it was at one time much larger. It must be carefully borne in mind that during the earlier and greater part of his long life Bentham was not a reformer of constitutions, but a reformer of law. He was the first Englishman to see clearly how the legislative powers of the state, very sparingly employed for this object before, could be used to rearrange and reconstruct civil jurisprudence and adapt it to its professed ends. He became a radical reformer, an expression to which, as I said before, he gave a new respectability through sheer despair. The British Constitution in his day might no doubt have been improved in many of its parts, but, in his impatience of delay in legislative reforms, he attributed to inherent defects in the Constitution obstructions which were mainly owing to the effects produced on the entire national mind by detestation of principles, strongly condemned by himself, which had brought on France the Reign of Terror and on the entire continent the military despotism of Napoleon Bonaparte. Superficially, the ideal political system for which he argued in a series of pamphlets has not a little resemblance to that of Rousseau and Sieyès. There was to be a single-chambered democracy, one all-powerful representative assembly, with powers unrestricted theoretically, but with its action facilitated and guided by a strange and complex apparatus of subordinate institutions. The real difference between his plans and those of the French theorists lay in their philosophical justification. The system of Rousseau was based on the pretended natural rights of men, and it owes to this basis a hold on weaker and less instructed minds, which is rather increasing than diminishing. But Bentham utterly repudiated those natural rights, and denounced the conception of them as absurd and anarchical. During the first or law-reforming period of his life, which lasted till he was more than 60 years old, he had firmly grasped the greatest happiness of the greatest number, a form of words found in Beccaria, as the proper standard of legislative reform, but, observing the close association of law with morals, he had made the bolder attempt to reform moral ideas on the same principle, and by a sort of legislation to force men to think and feel, as well as to act, in conformity with his standard. As the Great War proceeded, the time became more and more unfavorable for Bentham's experiment, and finally he himself declared that the cause of reform was lost on the plains of Waterloo. It was then that he began his attack on the British Constitution, and published his proposals for reconstructing it from base to apex. As the classes which it placed in power refused to recognize or promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number, he proposed to displace them and to hand over all political authority to the greatest number itself. It must necessarily follow his standard, he argued. Every man and every number of men seeks its own happiness, and the greatest number armed with legislative power must legislate for its own happiness. This reasoning had great effect on some of the most powerful minds of Bentham's day. His disciples Grote, the 2 Mills, Molesworth, the 2 Austins, and Roebuck did really do much to transform the British Constitution. Some of them, however, lived long enough to be disenchanted by the results, and, I have attempted to show in a former essay, many of these results would have met with the deepest disapproval from Bentham himself. The truth is, there was a serious gap in his reasoning. Little can be said against the greatest happiness of the greatest number as a standard of legislation, and indeed it is the only standard which the legislative power, when once called into action, can possibly follow. It is inconceivable that any legislator should deliberately propose or pass a measure intended to diminish the happiness of the majority of the citizens. But when this multitudinous majority is called to the government for the purpose of promoting its own happiness, it now becomes evident that, independently of the enormous difficulty of obtaining any conclusion from a multitude of men, there is no security that this multitude will know what its own happiness is, or how it can be promoted. On this point it must be owned that Rousseau shows himself wiser than Bentham. He claimed for the entire community that it should be sovereign and that it should exercise its sovereignty in the plenitude of power, because these were its natural rights, but, though he claimed for it that it should be all-powerful, he did not claim that it was all-wise, for he knew that it was not. The people, he said, always meant well, but it does not always judge well. Rousseau was led by these misgivings almost to doubt the practical possibility of wise legislation by his ideal democracy. He seems to have thought that the legislator who could properly guide the people in the exercise of their sovereign powers would only appear at long intervals, and must virtually be semi-divine. In connection with these ideas, he made a prediction which has contributed nearly as much to his fame as any of his social and political speculations. Sharing the general interest and sympathy which the gallant struggle of the Corsicans for independence had excited in his day, he persuaded himself that the ideal legislator would most probably arise in Corsica. J'ai quelques pressentiments, he writes, qu'un jour, cette petite île est un l'Europe. The prophecy has been repeatedly taken to mean that Rousseau foresaw the birth in Corsica, 7 years later, of a military genius after whom the Code Civil of France would be named. One further remark, not perhaps at first sight obvious, ought to be made of these political theories of Rousseau and Bentham which contribute so largely to the mental stock of the classes now rising to power in Europe. These theories were, in their origin, theories not of constitutional reform, but of law reform. It is unnecessary to give new proof of this assertion as respects Bentham. But it is also true of Rousseau. The conceptions of nature, of natural law, and of natural right, which prompted and shaped his political speculations, are first found in the language of the Roman lawyers. It is more than doubtful whether these illustrious men ever believed in the state of nature as a reality, but they seem to have thought that, under all the perverse technicalities of ancient law, there lay a simple and symmetrical system of rules which were in some sense those of nature. Their natural law was, for all practical purposes, simple or simplified law. This view, with all its philosophical defects, led to a great simplification of law both in the Roman state and in modern Europe, and indeed was the chief source of law reform until the system of Bentham, which also aimed at the simplification of law, made its appearance. But the undoubted descent both of the French and the English political theory from theories of law reform points to a serious weakness in them. That because you can successfully reform jurisprudence on certain principles, you can successfully reform constitutions on the same principles, is not a safe inference. In the first place, the simplification of civil law, its disentanglement from idle forms, technicalities, obscurities, and illogicalities, can scarcely be other than a beneficial process. It may indeed lead to disappointment. Bentham thought that, if law were reformed on his principles, litigation would be easy, cheap, and expeditious, yet, now that nearly all his proposals have been adopted, the removal of legal difficulties seems to have brought into still greater nakedness the difficulties of questions of fact. But, though the simplification of law may lead to disappointment, it can scarcely lead to danger. It is, however, idle to conceal from oneself that the simplification of political institutions leads straight to absolutism, the absolutism not of an expert judge, but of a single man or of a multitude striving to act as if it were a single man. The illogicalities swept away in the process may really be buttresses which helped to support the vast burden of government, or checks which mitigated the consequences of the autocrat's undeniable fallibility. Again, a mistake in law reform is of small importance. It mainly affects a class of whose grievances, I may observe, Bentham had far too exalted a notion, the small part of the community which actually goes to law. If committed, it can be corrected with comparative ease. But a mistake in constitutional innovation directly affects the entire community and every part of it. It may be fraught with calamity or ruin, public or private. And correction is virtually impossible. It is practically taken for granted among us, that all constitutional changes are final and must be submitted to, whatever their consequences. Doubtless this assumption arises from a general belief that, in these matters, we are propelled by an irresistible force on a definite path towards an unavoidable end towards democracy, as towards death. If there be force in the considerations which I have urged, the ideas current among us as to the age of progress through which we are supposed to be passing will stand in need of a great deal of modification. In one important particular, they will have to be exactly reversed. The natural condition of mankind, if that word natural is used, is not the progressive condition. It is a condition not of changeableness but of unchangeableness. The immobility of society is the rule, its mobility is the exception. The toleration of change and the belief in its advantages are still confined to the smallest portion of the human race, and even with that portion they are extremely modern. They are not much more than a century old on the continent of Europe, and not much more than half a century old in Great Britain. When they are found, the sort of change which they contemplate is of a highly special kind, being exclusively political change. The process is familiar enough to Englishmen. A number of persons, often a small minority, obtain the ear of the governing part of the community, and persuade it to force the entire community to conform itself to their ideas. Doubtless there is a general submission to this process, and an impression even among those who dislike it that it will go very far. But when the causes of this state of feeling are examined, they appear to arise in a very small degree from intelligent conviction, but to a very great extent from the remote effects of words and notions derived from broken down political theories. If this be the truth, or even an approximation to the truth, it suggests some very simple and obvious inferences. If modern society be not essentially and normally changeable, the attempt to conduct it safely through the unusual and exceptional process of change is not easy but extremely difficult. What is easy to a man is that which has come to him through a long inherited experience, like walking or using his fingers. What is difficult to him is that in which such experience gives him little guidance or none at all, like riding or skating. It is extremely probable that the Darwinian rule, small changes benefit the organism, holds good of communities of men, but a sudden sweeping political reform constantly places the community in the position of an individual who should mount a horse solely on the strength of his studies in a work on horsemanship. These conclusions, which I venture to think are conclusions of common sense, go a long way to explain a series of facts which at first sight are not quite intelligible. What is the reason of the advantage which historical constitutions gradually develop through the accumulation of experience, appear as a fact to enjoy over a priori constitutions founded on speculative assumptions remote from experience? That the advantage exists, will hardly be denied by any educated Englishman. With conservatives this is of course an axiom, but there are few really eminent men on the opposite side who do not from time to time betray the same opinion, especially in presence of a catastrophe suffered by some constitution of the last mentioned type. Not many persons in the last century could have divined from the previous opinions of Edmund Burke the real substructure of his political creed, or did in fact suspect it till it was uncovered by the early and comparatively slight miscarriage of French revolutionary institutions. A great disillusion has always seemed to me to separate the thoughts on the present discontents in 1770 and the speech on American taxation in 1774 from the magnificent panegyric on the British Constitution in 1790. Our political system is placed in a just correspondence and symmetry with the order of the world and with the mode of existence decreed to a permanent body composed of transitory parts, wherein, by the disposition of a stupendous wisdom, molding together the great mysterious incorporation of the human race, the whole, at one time, is never old, or middle-aged, or young, but in a condition of unchangeable constancy moves on through the varied tenor of perpetual decay, fall, renovation, and progression. Thus, in preserving that method of nature in the conduct of the state, in what we improve we are never wholly new, in what we retain, we are never wholly obsolete. Macaulay, again, happened to have to close his account of the Revolution of 1688 just when a new French experiment in a priori constitution building had spread confusion through the continent of Europe, and his picture of the events which gave birth to the party that had a monopoly of his admiration would almost rob them of their historical name of Revolution Whigs, which he nevertheless claimed for them. As our revolution was a vindication of ancient rights, so it was conducted with strict attention to ancient formalities. In almost every word and act may be discerned a profound reverence for the past. The estates of the realm deliberated in the old halls and according to the old rules. The speeches present an almost ludicrous contrast to the revolutionary oratory of every other country. Both the English parties agreed in treating with solemn respect the ancient constitutional traditions of the state. The only question was, in what sense these traditions were to be understood. The assertors of liberty said nothing about the natural equality of man and the inalienable sovereignty of the people, about Harmodius or Timoleon, Brutus the elder or Brutus the younger. When they were told that, by the English law, the crown, at the moment of a demise, must descend to the next heir, they answered that, by the English law, a living man could have no heir. When they were told that there was no precedent for declaring the throne vacant, they produced from among the records in the Tower a roll of parchment, near 300 years old, on which, in quaint characters and barbarous Latin, it was recorded that the estates of the realm had declared vacant the throne of a perfidious and tyrannical Plantagenet. When at length the dispute had been accommodated, the new sovereigns were proclaimed with the old pageantry. All the fantastic pomp of heraldry was there, Clarenceau and Narroy, portcullis and rouge dragon, the trumpets, the banners, the grotesque coats embroidered with lions and lilies. The title of King of France, assumed by the conqueror of Crécy, was not omitted in the royal style. To us, who have lived in the year 1848, it may seem almost an abuse of terms to call a proceeding, conducted with so much deliberation, with so much sobriety, and with such minute attention to prescriptive etiquette, by the terrible name of revolution. In the light of historical facts, neither the rhetoric of Burke nor the rhetoric of Macaulay is unjust. I will not undertake to hold the balance of success or failure among the 350 constitutions which a modern writer declares to have come into existence since the beginning of this century, but if we take our standing ground at the end of the century preceding, when a priori constitutions first appeared, we find it certain that among all historical constitutions there have been no failures so great and terrible as those of constitutions of the other class. There have been oppressive constitutions of the historical type, there have been constitutions which mischievously obstructed the path of improvement, but with these there has been nothing like the disastrous course and end of the three constitutions which announce their character by beginning with a declaration of the Eights of Man, the French semi-monarchical constitution of 1791, the French Republican Constitution of 1793, and the French Republican Directorial Constitution of 1795. Nor has any historical constitution had the ludicrous fate of the Constitution of December 1799, which came from the hands of CIs a marvel of balanced powers, and became by a single transposition the charter of a pure despotism. All this, however, is extremely intelligible, if human nature has always a very limited capacity, as in general it has very slight taste, for adjusting itself to new conditions. The utmost it can do is to select parts of its experience and apply them tentatively to these conditions, and this process is always awkward and often dangerous. A community with a new a priori political constitution is at best in the disagreeable position of a British traveler whom a hospitable Chinese entertainer has constrained to eat a dinner with chopsticks. Let the new institutions be extraordinarily wide of experience, and inconvenience becomes imminent peril. The body politic is in that case like the body natural transported to a new climate, unaccustomed food, and strange surroundings. Sometimes it perishes altogether. Sometimes the most unexpected parts of its organization develop themselves at the expense of others, and when the ingenious legislator had counted on producing a nation of self-denying and somewhat sentimental patriots, he finds that he has created a people of Jacobins or a people of slaves. It is in a high degree likely that the British Parliament and the British electorate will soon have to consider which of these two principles, assumption or experience, they will apply to a great and ancient institution, of all our institutions the one which on the whole has departed least from its original form. I put aside the question which of them it is that has been applied to the constituent body of the House of Commons. That is over, and its consequences, in Homeric phrase, lie upon the knees of the gods. But, surprising as was the way in which the question of franchise and redistribution ended, and in which the question of reconstructing the House of Lords, which had been mixed up with it, fell suddenly into the background, no observant man can doubt that the last question will before long press again for attention. The very variety of opinion which, as I pointed out in the last essay, prevails among politicians of every party color as to the mode in which the legal power of the House of Lords should be exercised, is an earnest of a controversy soon to be revived, and indeed the mere demand for continuous important legislation will soon force into notice so great an addition to the supply as the reform of the upper house. The quarrel which raged for a while on platforms and in the newspapers threw up a great number of suggestions for change, out of which very few were worthy of consideration. They varied from a proposal to dispense altogether with a second chamber to proposals for a chamber of peers nominated for life, proposals for empowering the Crown to select a limited number of peers out of the present body for service in each Parliament, proposals for giving to the entire present House of Lords the right to elect this limited number, proposals for a second chamber of experienced executive officers, and proposals for a Senate to which the local government circles, as yet unformed, should furnish constituencies. But, amid these loose guesses at a reasonable solution of a great question, there was much language employed which seemed to me to betray serious misconception of the nature of a second or upper house, and these opinions merit some consideration. Let me take first the most trenchant of the proposals recently before the country, the scheme for governing through a parliament consisting of a single chamber. This plan was advocated by Mr. J.S. Mill in one of his later writings, but it is just to him to bear in mind that in the single chamber he proposed there was to be a minutely accurate representation of minorities. This condition was dropped in the late controversy, and it was thought enough to quote the well-known epigram of CIs on the subject of second chambers. If, it runs, a second chamber dissents from the first, it is mischievous; if it agrees, it is superfluous. It has perhaps escaped notice that this saying is a conscious or unconscious parody of that reply of the Caliph Omar about the books of the Alexandrian library which caused them to be burnt. If the books, said the commander of the faithful to his lieutenant, differ from the book of the prophet, they are impious; if they agree, they are useless. The reasoning is precisely the same in both cases, and starts from the same assumption. It takes for granted that a particular utterance is divine. If the Quran is the inspired and exclusive word of God, Omar was right. If Vox Populi, Vox Dei, expresses a truth, Sives was right. If the decisions of the community, conveyed through one particular organ, are not only imperative but all-wise, a second chamber is a superfluity or an impertinence. There is no question that the generality of first chambers, or popularly elected houses, do make the assumption on which this argument rests. They do not nowadays rest their claim to authority on the English theory of the advantages of a balance of the historical elements in a given society. They do not appeal to the wise deduction from experience, as old as Aristotle, which no student of constitutional history will deny, that the best constitutions are those in which there is a large popular element. It is a singular proof of the widespread influence of the speculations of Rousseau that, although very few first chambers really represent the entire community, indeed, there is no agreement as to what the entire community is, and nobody is quite sure how it can be represented. Nevertheless, in Europe they almost invariably claim to reflect it, and, as a consequence, they assume an air of divinity which, if it rightfully belonged to them, would be fatal to all argument for a second chamber. There appears to me to be no escaping from the fact that all such institutions as a Senate, a House of Peers, or a second chamber, are founded on a denial or a doubt of the proposition that the voice of the people is the voice of God. They express the revolt of a great mass of human common sense against it. They are the fruit of the agnosticism of the political understanding. Their authors and advocates do not assert that the decisions of a popularly elected chamber are always or generally wrong. These decisions are very often right. But it is impossible to be sure that they are right. And the more the difficulties of multitudinous government are probed, and the more carefully the influences acting upon it are examined, the stronger grows the doubt of the infallibility of popularly elected legislatures. What, then, is expected from a well-constituted second chamber is not a rival infallibility, but an additional security. It is hardly too much to say that, in this view, almost any second chamber is better than none. No such chamber can be so completely unsatisfactory that its concurrence does not add some weight to a presumption that the first chamber is in the right, but doubtless upper houses may be so constituted, and their discussions so conducted, that their concurrence would render this presumption virtually conclusive. The conception of an upper house as a mere revising body, trusted with the privilege of dotting I's and crossing T's in measures sent up by the other chamber, seems to me as irrational as it is poor. What is wanted from an upper house is the security of its concurrence, after full examination of the measure concurred in. It requires some attention to facts to see how widely spread is the misgiving as to the absolute wisdom of popularly elected chambers. I will not stop to examine the American phenomena of this class, but will merely observe in passing, that the one thoroughly successful institution which has been established since the tide of modern democracy began to run, is a second chamber, the American Senate. On the continent of Europe there are no states without second chambers, except three: Greece, Servia, and Bulgaria, all resembling one another in having long been portions of the Turkish Empire, and in being now very greatly under the influence of the Russian government. Russia has not, Turkey never had, any true aristocracy, any root of gentlemen, to repeat Bacon's expression. And we shall see presently that the framers of constitutions, in their search for materials of a second chamber other than the ordinary forms of popular election, have constantly had to build, at all events partially, on the foundation of an aristocracy. But, with the exception of the three communities just mentioned, all the European states have second chambers, varying from that of Norway, where, after a single general election, a certain number of the deputies returned are told off to make an upper house, to the ultra-aristocratic house of magnates established from the earliest time under the ancient Hungarian constitution. Hereditary peers, generally mixed with life peers and elective peers, are still common in the second chambers of the continent. They are found in Cis-Leithan Austria, in Prussia, in Bavaria, in many of the smaller German states, in Spain, and in Portugal. There is much reason to believe that the British House of Lords would have been exclusively, or at all events much more extensively, copied in the constitutions of the continent, but for one remarkable difficulty. This is not in the least any dislike or distrust of the hereditary principle, but the extreme numerousness of the nobility in most continental societies, and the consequent difficulty of selecting a portion of them to be exclusively privileged. Sieyes, in his famous pamphlet, observes that in 1789 the higher French aristocracy was eager to have a House of Lords engrafted on the new French constitution, and this ambition, as Burke noticed, was the secret of the fervor, the suicidal fervor, as it afterwards turned out, with which a certain number of the noblest French families threw in their lot with the revolutionary movement. Sieyes, however, pointed out the fatal obstacle to these hopes. It was the number and the theoretical equality of the nobles. His calculation was that, in all France, there were no less than 110,000 noblemen. There were 10,000 in Brittany alone. The proportions which this difficulty sometimes still assumes on the continent may be inferred from one curious instance. The combined parliament of the two small states called respectively Mecklenburg-Schwerin and Mecklenburg-Strelitz is a medieval diet, very slightly changed. It now consists of 731 members, of whom 684 are persons of knightly rank, holding land by knightly tenure. As a rule, however, this numerousness of the nobility causes the privilege of sitting in the upper house to be confined to comparatively few peers of very high and universally acknowledged rank, and hereditary peers are seldom found without an intermixture of life peers. Life peers also occur by themselves, but the Crown is generally directed by the Constitution to select them from certain classes of distinguished men. The best example of an upper house formed by this method is the Italian Senate. In the French Republic and in most of the monarchical European states, elective senators are found, either by themselves or together with life senators or hereditary peers. The mode of choosing them deserves careful attention. Sometimes the senatorial electorate is different from that which chooses the lower house, where, for instance, there is a property qualification. It is often higher in the case of senatorial electors than in the case of electors for a chamber of deputies. More often, however, as in the case of France, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium, the elective senators are chosen by an electorate which in principle is the same with that which returns the other chamber. But then the electors are differently grouped. Provinces, cities, communes, elect the senators, while the deputies are assumed to be chosen by the nation at large. Nothing brings out so clearly as does this class of contrivances a fundamental doubt afflicting the whole democratic theory. It is taken for granted that a popular electorate will be animated by a different spirit according as it is grouped, but why should there be any connection between the grouping of the people and the voice of the people? The truth is, that as soon as we begin to reflect seriously on modes of practically applying the democratic principle, we find that some vital preliminary questions have never been settled. Granting that the people is entitled of right to govern, how is it to give its decisions and orders? Rousseau answers that all the people must meet periodically in assembly. Sieyes replies that it may speak through representatives, but he spent a life and displayed marvels of ingenuity in devising systems of representation, and the difficulties which he never succeeded in solving still perplex the absolute theorist. Vox populi may be vox Dei, but very little attention shows that there never has been any agreement as to what vox means or as to what populus means. Is the voice of the people the voice which speaks through scrutin d'arrondissement or through scrutin de liste, by plebiscite or by tumultuary assembly? Is it a sound in which the note struck by minorities is entirely silent? Is the people which speaks, the people according to household suffrage, or the people according to universal suffrage, the people with all the women excluded from it, or the people, men, women, and children together, assembling casually in voluntary meeting? None of these questions have been settled, some have hardly been thought about. In reality, the devotee of democracy is much in the same position as the Greeks with their oracles. All agreed that the voice of an oracle was the voice of a god, but everybody allowed that when he spoke he was not as intelligible as might be desired, and nobody was quite sure whether it was safer to go to Delphi or to Dodona. It is needless to say that none of these difficulties embarrass the saner political theorist who holds that, in secular matters, it is better to walk by sight than by faith. As regards popularly elected chambers, he will be satisfied that, to Englishmen as to Greeks, experience has shown the best constitutions to be those in which the popular element is large, and he will readily admit that, as the structure of each society of men slowly alters, it is well to alter and amend the organization by which this element makes itself felt. But, as regards the far more difficult undertaking of reconstructing an upper house, he will hope that it will fall into the hands of men who have thoroughly brought home to themselves the truth, that only 2 second chambers have as yet had any duration, to speak of the American Senate, with all its success a creation of yesterday, and the ancient English House of Lords. It is very difficult to obtain from the younger institution any lessons which can be of use in the reconstruction of the older. The Senate of the United States is, in strictness, no more a democratic institution than the House of Lords. As I shall point out in the following essay, it is founded on inequality of representation, not on equality. But then, on the other hand, the several states which depute the senators to Washington are for the most part of older origin than the federal union. They still retain some portion of sovereignty, and thus no artificial local government circles which may be created in this country will have more than a superficial resemblance to them. It is only, I am persuaded, by careful examination of infirmities which experience has shown to exist in the House of Lords, and by careful consideration of doubts which have actually arisen as to the principles proper for it to follow in exercising its legal powers, that hints of any kind can be gathered respecting its possible improvement. The most competent reformers of the House of Lords will probably be those who understand it from belonging to it, and doubtless there are times when the maxim of Portalis applies, tu faut innover quand la plus funeste de toutes les innovations serait de ne point innover. Meantime, there does not seem to me to be anything in the thought and tendencies of our day which lends support to the vague propositions powerful, I admit, through their very vagueness, which suggest that the improvement of the House of Lords is a desperate undertaking. One hears it said that the House of Lords consists of great landowners, and that the history of landed property in great masses is nearly ended, that the privileges of the peers are hereditary, and that an hereditary right to share in government is absurd, and that the age of aristocracies and of aristocratic ascendancy is gone forever. These are very broad generalities, against which may be set off other generalities, perhaps equally broad, but much better supported by experience and observation. It certainly does appear that, for the moment, landed property is seriously threatened. Yet it demands but little penetration of mind to see that most of the current objections to it are objections to all private property, and there may again be a time when it is recognized that the possession of a great estate, as is natural in a form of ownership probably descended from a form of sovereignty, implies more administrative power and kindlier relations with other classes having subordinate interests than almost any other kind of superiority founded on wealth. The assertion of the inherent absurdity of an hereditary legislature will seem itself absurd to those who can follow the course of scientific thought in our day. Under all systems of government, under monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy alike, it is a mere chance whether the individual called to the direction of public affairs will be qualified for the undertaking, but the chance of his competence, so far from being less under aristocracy than under the other two systems, is distinctly greater. If the qualities proper for the conduct of government can be secured in a limited class or body of men, there is a strong probability that they will be transmitted to the corresponding class in the next generation, although no assertion be possible as to individuals. Whether in this is the last objection the age of aristocracies be over, I cannot take upon myself to say. I have sometimes thought it one of the chief drawbacks on modern democracy that, while it gives birth to despotism with the greatest facility, it does not seem to be capable of producing aristocracy, though from that form of political and social ascendancy all improvement has hitherto sprung. But some of the keenest observers of democratic society in our day do not share this opinion. Noticing that the modern movement towards democracy is coupled with a movement towards scientific perfection, they appear to be persuaded that the world will some day fall under intellectual aristocracies. Society is to become the church of a sort of political Calvinism, in which the elect are to be the men with exceptional brains. This seems to be the view suggested by French democratic society to M. Ernest Renan. Whether such an aristocracy, if it wielded all the power which the command of all scientific results placed in its hands, would be exactly beneficent, may possibly be doubted. The faults to which the older privileged orders are liable are plain enough and at times very serious. They are in some characters idleness, luxuriousness, insolence, and frivolity; in others, and more particularly in our day, they are timidity, distrust of the permanence of anything ancient and great, and, what is worse, a belief that no reputation can be made by a member of an ancient and great institution except by helping to pull it down. But, assuming the utmost indulgence in these faults, I may be permitted to doubt whether mankind would derive unmixed advantage from putting in their place an ascetic aristocracy of men of science, with intellects perfected by unremitting exercise, absolutely confident in themselves and absolutely sure of their conclusions. The question, however, will not long or deeply trouble those who, like me, have the strongest suspicion that, if there really arise a conflict between democracy and science, democracy, which is already taking precautions against the enemy, will certainly win. Note A. An addendum to Essay 3. Mr. Tyler has justly observed that the true lesson of the new science of comparative mythology is the barrenness in primitive times of the faculty which we most associate with mental fertility, the imagination. Comparative jurisprudence, as might be expected from the natural stability of law and custom, yet more strongly suggests the same inference, and points to the fewness of ideas and the slowness of additions to the mental stock as among the most general characteristics of mankind in its infancy. The fact that the generation of new ideas does not proceed in all states of society as rapidly as in that to which we belong, is only not familiar to us through our inveterate habit of confining our observation of human nature to a small portion of its phenomena. When we undertake to examine it, we are very apt to look exclusively at a part of Western Europe and perhaps of the American continent. We constantly leave aside India, China, and the whole Mohammedan East. This limitation of our field of vision is perfectly justifiable when we are occupied with the investigation of the laws of progress. Progress is, in fact, the same thing as the continued production of new ideas, and we can only discover the law of this production by examining sequences of ideas where they are frequent and of considerable length. But the primitive condition of the progressive societies is best ascertained from the observable condition of those which are non-progressive, and thus we leave a serious gap in our knowledge when we put aside the mental state of the millions upon millions of men who fill what we vaguely call the East as a phenomenon of little interest and of no instructiveness. The fact is not unknown to most of us that, among these multitudes, literature, religion, and art or what corresponds to them move always within a distinctly drawn circle of unchanging notions, but the fact that this condition of thought is rather the infancy of the human mind prolonged than a different maturity from that most familiar to us, is very seldom brought home to us with a clearness rendering it fruitful of instruction. I do not, indeed, deny that the difference between the East and the West, in respect of the different speed at which new ideas are produced, is only a difference of degree. There were new ideas produced in India even during the disastrous period just before the English entered it, and in the earlier ages this production must have been rapid. There must have been a series of ages during which the progress of China was very steadily maintained, and doubtless our assumption of the absolute immobility of the Chinese and other societies is in part the expression of our ignorance. Conversely, I question whether new ideas come into being in the West as rapidly as modern literature and conversation sometimes suggest. It cannot, indeed, be doubted that causes, unknown to the ancient world, lead among us to the multiplication of ideas. Among them are the never-ceasing discovery of new facts of nature, inventions changing the circumstances and material conditions of life, and new rules of social conduct. The chief of this last class, and certainly the most powerful in the domain of law proper, I take to be the famous maxim that all institutions should be adapted to produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Nevertheless, there are not a few signs that even conscious efforts to increase the number of ideas have a very limited success. Look at poetry and fiction. From time to time one mind endowed with the assemblage of qualities called genius makes a great and sudden addition to the combinations of thought, word, and sound which it is the province of those arts to produce, yet as suddenly, after one or a few such efforts, the productive activity of both branches of invention ceases, and they settle down into imitativeness for perhaps a century at a time. An humbler example may be sought in rules of social habit. We speak of the caprices of fashion, yet, on examining them historically, we find them singularly limited, so much so, that we are sometimes tempted to regard fashion as passing through cycles of form ever repeating themselves. There are, in fact, more natural limitations on the fertility of intellect than we always admit to ourselves, and these, reflected in bodies of men, translate themselves into that weariness of novelty which seems at intervals to overtake whole Western societies, including minds of every degree of information and cultivation. My present object is to point out some of the results of mental sterility at a time when society is in the stage which we have been considering. Then, the relations between man and man were summed up in kinship. The fundamental assumption was that all men, not united with you by blood, were your enemies or your slaves. Gradually the assumption became untrue in fact, and men, who were not blood relatives, became related to one another on terms of peace and mutual tolerance or mutual advantage. Yet no new ideas came into being exactly harmonizing with the new relation, nor was any new phraseology invented to express it. The new member of each group was spoken of as akin to it, was treated as akin to it, was thought of as akin to it. So little were ideas changed that, as we shall see, the very affections and emotions which the natural bond evoked were called forth in extraordinary strength by the artificial tie. The clear apprehension of these facts throws light on several historical problems, and among them on some of Irish history. Yet they ought not greatly to surprise us, since, in a modified form, they make part of our everyday experience. Almost everybody can observe that, when new circumstances arise, we use our old ideas to bring them home to us. It is only afterwards, and sometimes long afterwards, that our ideas are found to have changed. An English court of justice is in great part an engine for working out this process. New combinations of circumstance are constantly arising, but in the first instance they are exclusively interpreted according to old legal ideas. A little later lawyers admit that the old ideas are not quite what they were before the new circumstances arose. The slow generation of ideas in ancient times may first be adduced as necessary to the explanation of that great family of fictions which meet us on the threshold of history and historical jurisprudence.